This Lighthouse podcast episode, done within the Reunir Horizon project, I have the pleasure to host Tonijem Lorensom, Research Fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security, and we will be talking about the EU's common security and defense policy, external threats, the future of NATO-EU relations after the Trump victory, the US elections, and the sustainability of the EU's support to Ukraine.
Welcome to the Reunir podcast. Brought to you by Reunir, a Horizon Europe research project. With 12 partners from across Europe, Reunir seeks to strengthen the EU's foreign and security policy. It does so by examining external threats to the military, socio-economic and democratic resilience of 9 countries in the Western Balkans and the EU's eastern neighborhood. All this in a new era of international relations. The first series of the podcast features episodes that revolve around external threats vis-à-vis Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia against the backdrop of their European integration path. These episodes are produced by Reunir consortium partners from the Western Balkans and the EU's eastern neighborhood. This episode is recorded in English.
Tonijem Lorensom is Head of Defense Policy and Strategy Program and Research Fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security. He has worked at the center since 2006 on a variety of defense policy issues, including European defense policy, air defense of the 3 Baltic states, and the maritime aspects of defense in the Baltic region. Between 2005 and 2013, Tony was also an assistant professor at the Baltic Defense College.
So, Tony, welcome to the Lighthouse podcast. So, the war in Ukraine, which erupted to a full-scale conflict in February 2022, has completely reshaped global security priorities and significantly impacted Europe's security landscape. The EU is facing threats from Russia, but also from China, and this has put its capacity to respond and adapt through the CSDP to the test. So my first question to you, Tony, is the EU ready to face present security challenges?
Thanks, Srđan, and let me first of all say thanks for the invitation to join you today. It's a real pleasure. So is the EU ready to face security challenges? If I was to sum it up in one sentence, I would say more than it was a few years ago. But we certainly have a long way to go. And I guess to start with, you have to think about, what is the CSDP actually for? What security challenges is it expected to face? Over the past 25 years or so of its existence, very few people have argued that we should be organising the defence of Europe, as in against military invasion, through the CSDP. So it hasn't been designed to do that, and it's certainly not ready to do that. But that's been okay because we've had NATO, and most EU member states are also NATO member states as well. If you look at what's happened since the start of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, I think there's been a kind of a strengthening of this consensus of a division of labour between NATO and the EU. So NATO is the organisation that we go to for defence, and probably also some crisis management, and the EU can also do some crisis management, and has a growing role in capacity building. So both inside, with the member states, but also outside in third countries. It may be that we need to reevaluate that formula in the coming years, depending on exactly what the Trump presidency means for us. But if that's the start point, then I think there are certainly reasons to be at least a little bit positive about the CSDP. There have been, there still are, a number of CSDP crisis management operations, civilian and military, which have been reasonably successful. And in terms of the capacity building side, the EU has developed its ability, particularly over the last few years. So internally through initiatives like PESCO, like the Defence Fund, but also I think the EU's role in this outside the Union itself has been particularly impressive. The support we've given to Ukraine in training and in delivering weapons. Unfortunately, most of that is outweighed on the negative side. So the EU's enthusiastic words about defence have rarely been matched in equally enthusiastic action. And this has been the case all through the history of the CSDP and the ESDP before it. And it's pretty clear, I think, that a lack of capability places quite severe constraints on what the CSDP can do. And that's the biggest challenge that faces us as member states at the moment. I mean, we're still militarily pretty weak, and that will constrain the CSDP. And what's more, our kind of apathy in this also makes it harder for us to persuade the Americans to be involved in security of the continent, which is itself a security challenge. So yeah, we've got lots of catching up to do if we're going to add substance to our words.
But to come to focus on Ukraine, so the EU has provided really, one can say, unprecedented support to Ukraine, both militarily and economically. Would you believe that the current level of EU support is sustainable in the long term, both having in mind the economic but also potential political constraints, because we just saw the fall of the German government. We'll have elections in many EU member states with the possible rise of the pro-Russian populist parties in them. So how do you see the sustainability of EU support to Ukraine in the long run?
Yeah. I mean, once again, I think there are reasons to be positive and reasons to be gloomy. This is my civil service background and sitting on the fence coming out here. I think, there is today this kind of general view, and I think a lot of this is to do with the way that the media talks about the conflict. But there's this general view that Ukraine supporters have become a bit weary of the war, that we're looking for negotiations to bring it to an end. Although, that outcome is not particularly likely. I mean, neither Ukraine nor Russia seems to want that at the moment. But that kind of sense of weariness doesn't really seem to be translated into a reduction of the practical support that we're giving to Ukraine, at least so far. And if you look at how assistance has varied over the course of the past couple of years, I mean, there are certainly peaks and troughs, but it's actually been pretty consistent. The overall level has been pretty consistent, and in fact, quite recently there was a peak around the summertime. There were lots of commitments made by supporting states around the time of the Washington summit. Also, I think it's positive that NATO and EU member states are looking for new ways to provide assistance. So, for example, using the profits from frozen Russian assets, NATO's pledge for long-term security assistance that was made at Washington, the EU's Ukraine facility on the kind of financial side. But at the same time, it's also undeniable that there are really quite important signs that assistance could drop over the coming 12 months or so. Germany, which has been Europe's biggest donor, has said that it will cut its support by half. At least that in part that can be attributed to a kind of a failing of the European peace facility. And of course, under Trump, I mean, there's a risk that support will be severely curtailed or maybe even stopped altogether. So I think a lot depends on how these dynamics play out in the coming months. And will others follow the US? I mean, this seems to be what, for example, Viktor Orban is suggesting. Or will they in fact be galvanized to step up and to fill the gap that the US will leave behind? So, we have a risky period in front of us, that's for sure, and the more so if Trump's actions inside NATO create divisions inside the alliance. But I think there's certainly no reason to believe at the moment that everything is lost. But just to make one more quick point about this, I mean, you talked at the beginning, your question was about sustaining current levels of support. But that's probably not enough. I mean, we've sustained this level of support for 1,000 days now, and at the moment Russia seems to be on the front foot and to be making gains in eastern Ukraine. So, this adds an additional challenge to us. I mean, we don't only need to sustain current levels of support, but if we want Ukraine to prevail, I mean, which we certainly should, we need to raise those levels of support to a higher level.
But do you think that's are you optimistic or more gloomy when it comes to that prospect?
I'm usually optimistic about this. I mean, as I say, there are peaks and troughs in our support, and you can see this in the data. And those effects get reported by the press and tend to create a kind of an image of the conflict, which is not necessarily a very faithful one. So I think all European nations recognise the importance of supporting Ukraine. I mean, I think it's unquestionable that the cohesion is very strong, but maybe there are certain differences in what that actually means in practice, in terms of speed, in terms of urgency. And that's what we've got to kind of continue to discuss and continue to make the case amongst ourselves of the need to kind of press ahead with this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So back to the transatlantic partnership. It's, still, as you also pointed out, the cornerstone of Europe's security architecture. But it faces uncertainties, and especially now with the Trump victory in the US elections. In his previous term, Trump seriously considered whether the US should remain a NATO member. So how do you foresee the NATO-EU relationship evolving? Is it time to seriously conceive of a European security architecture outside of NATO, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, we need to recognise that the idea that Europe should do more for itself and then the US should do correspondingly less is certainly not a new idea. I mean, the recent history, President Obama back in 2011 announced this shift to the east, pivot to Asia, and successive US presidents have all kind of taken less of an interest in Europe than perhaps we would wish them to do. And inside NATO itself, I mean, this issue of transatlantic burden sharing has been controversial right from the very start. So it's clearly the case that we in Europe have not done enough. Even as the risks to our own security have grown as they have over the past 10, 15 years. So Trump is a kind of continuation of this trend, this theme, albeit perhaps potentially much more extreme form of this trend. And it's really hard to predict what's actually going to come out of this. I mean, Trump himself often says things which never actually happen in practice. I mean, he seems to kind of thrive on this idea of chaos, of provocation. So the actual practical outcomes are really hard to predict, but there's certainly a range of possibilities. I mean, I think at the very best we'll see a NATO which has a much more hostile US presence and a much more transactional kind of form of US presence.
Because this is what, sorry to interrupt, but Kyron Skinner, Trump's former policy planning chief under the Secretary of State at the time, Mike Pompeo, and one of the key players in Project 2025, basically talked about, when talking about NATO, emphasized the need for more European spending. So this is a story that we have already heard, but now it's in this, so to speak, unconfirmed policy document of the new presidency, and this is where, and Trump in a separate interview said that offering NATO membership for Ukraine was a mistake, and hinted at somewhat foreclosing further NATO expansion overall. So what do you think really is the future of NATO under this? Like, are we just to think that, okay, maybe this is going to be the repetition of the previous presidency, but there are signs that the new presidency will actually want to bring things further when it comes to the Trump agenda, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, once again, I think it's really hard to predict because we don't really know what that agenda is. And Trump has this idea of he makes statements which aren't necessarily followed up. I think it's absolutely the case that we will see more pressure inside the alliance for Europeans to spend more on defence. But once again, I mean, this was clearly a theme of Trump 1.0, back in 2016. But this again is not a new issue. I mean, America has been badgering Europe to spend more on defence for quite some time. So maybe, in one sense, this is not a bad thing. I mean, this is maybe the kick in the pants that Europe needs in order to finally get serious about what its responsibilities ought to be. So, I think it's by no means a given that NATO will collapse, or that America will even withdraw from NATO, but those are certainly risks. Even in the worst case, a US withdrawal from NATO wouldn't necessarily mean the end of the alliance itself. The alliance can continue without America. It would be a much more toothless NATO, obviously. But there are habits and experiences and practices inside NATO which would be a shame just to throw away. So, but clearly there are other options for Europe in this kind of eventuality. The EU itself could become the focus of a defence dimension. Some other, of course, that would mean that the UK, at least at the moment, would not be involved. But there are other options as well. Maybe something entirely new would be needed. So, I think as think tankers, it's kind of important that we start to think about this kind of thing, even if governments are reluctant to talk about it at the moment, to start to think about the options and what they might entail.
Mm-hmm. So, coming back maybe to, possibly linking it to the possible options there, but we talked about the CSDP briefly, but I want to ask you specifically, now, what steps do you believe the EU needs to take to make it more robust and adaptable to rapidly changing security dynamics? You mentioned the existing examples, but are there examples of reforms and initiatives regarding CSDP that you find promising, and can you maybe tell us something about them?
Sure. Yeah. I think the tools are mostly kind of in place and are fit for purpose. One of the problems with the EU has been that we kind of have these initiatives that then kind of lead nowhere. So I don't think we need much more by way of new initiatives. But as ever, the problem with CSDP, ESDP before it has been a lack of political will by the member states to give substance to these initiatives. And today we have the additional problem not only of will, but also of huge amounts of money that we need to support these initiatives. The defence industrial strategy, which I think is potentially a very promising avenue for capability development, it also includes a lot of involvement of Ukraine in that initiative. This can be a really, really useful thing, but it needs an awful lot of money. People are talking about hundreds of billions. The designated defence commissioner was speaking before the parliament in his confirmation hearings in early November, and he was talking about hundreds of billions required to give actual effect to this defence industrial strategy. So, it's up to us. It's in our hands, But the challenges are pretty big. There are lots of other demands for EU money for other kinds of projects besides defence.
Thank you. In November 2023, exactly a year ago, Ukrainian President Zelensky warned that if Russia is not stopped earlier, and as you say now, it seems to be even advancing on the Eastern Front, we may see a new conflicts emerge in Moldova and the Balkans. In Georgia, we saw the Georgian Dream Party use fear of a new war with Russia as one of the main points in their electoral campaign. We saw Russian interference in the Moldovan elections and referendums. So are we, Tony, likely to see the war spreading from Ukraine to other conflict points in Europe?
Yes, and Zelensky has talked about similar things in regard to the Baltic states as well, saying that we could also be follow-on ambitions of Vladimir Putin. Just to maybe be a little clear about what we were talking about earlier, that Russia being on the front foot now. I don't think we should kind of exaggerate this or make too much of it. Russia's progress, whilst it is making progress, is very slow and very costly. We're not at a kind of a tipping point for the war by any means. Yes, in terms of future conflicts involving other nations, I think the key here is to understand that we the states of Europe, we're not passive actors in this. Our destiny is not set. Our future is not decided by Russia. We can take action to confront the risks and the world around us. Donald Tusk, just ahead of the US presidential election, did a very nice kind of tweet in which he said, some claim that the future of Europe depends on the American elections, while it depends first and foremost on us. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. We need to seize the initiative ourselves. And this is mostly what we've already been talking about so far. This is about strengthening our defence capabilities. This is about understanding and acting on the idea that security of the EU is not just dependent on the EU nations themselves. It's dependent on security on the peripheries of Europe. And most immediately, it means continuing our support for Ukraine and helping Ukraine prevail in that conflict. I think we also, don't help ourselves by looking a little bit weak in the face of Russia. We need to stand up a little bit more, and I'm particularly thinking about in the hybrid domain. I mean, Russia gets away with an awful lot of hybrid actions against us without kind of any consequences. We need to think a little bit better about how we can deter those actions and about how we can respond to them collectively rather than individually.
But what can we do? I mean, we talked about the interference in, pretty, solid proofs about the interference in the Moldovan elections. And what should we do in this sense to let's say, at least render us a bit more resilience to these threats and attacks?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is not easy. I mean, if we had the solutions, I can't imagine we would not be implementing them now. But I mean, we can certainly think about sanctions, for states that act against us, and we can certainly, as you say, think about building our resilience. I mean, there are within Europe, there are key nations that we can look to who are very strong in this. I mean, Finland, our northern neighbour, is very good, world class in terms of resilience and comprehensive defence. There's a lot to learn from others. And again, I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that we tend to do this on our own. If you look at NATO and EU policy, I mean, the first thing you will read is that hybrid attacks are the responsibility of the attacked nation. We could do more collectively together to deal with this problem.
Mm-hmm. So the war in Ukraine has also revived conversations about EU enlargement and the stability of neighboring regions. So how critical do you think enlargement of the European Union is for the future security architecture of Europe? When it comes to the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo and Serbia remain outside of NATO for different reasons, but they are outside effectively of the alliance. So what is the place of the Western Balkans in this concrete sense, and not only when talking about Georgia, Moldova, to leave maybe Ukraine aside for a moment, but what is the place of these countries in the common European defense policy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. It's absolutely right. I think that Russia's war has revived these conversations. It sometimes seems that we're very good about talking about how security begins beyond our borders, but we're not necessarily very good at kind of taking the actions that would imply. I don't think I have any great insights here. I think the EU itself says it may be best when it says that enlargement is an investment in our peace and security. The EU has always been a peace project. I mean, right from the start of the European coal and steel communities, and it seems a bit kind of trivial or trite to put it in that way, but I mean, this is really the heart of the issue. So in terms of how critical enlargement is to security, I mean, can we get by without further enlargement? I mean, yes, of course we can. I mean, we've done this for several years. Is that the wise choice? Well, no, it's not. I live and work in Estonia. I see on a day-to-day basis the benefits of being inside these two organisations. Being able to live in a reasonably secure, certainly democratic rule of law society, and it would be hard to make arguments to deny those benefits to others. And I think it would also be hard to imagine that had those enlargements not taken place, that this would be the stable region that it is, and that it would not be a thorn in the side of the rest of Europe. So I think there's a very strong case for the Western Balkans to be as integrated as deeply as possible into the security arrangements that we benefit from. I mean, ideally that means membership, but short of that, and I'm thinking here of the EU rather than NATO, the EU might be more welcoming of third parties, particularly those that are on the accession path, in the various defence initiatives that we've already sort of talked about. These are tools of integration. For example, things like EDA associate membership, which I think Serbia is already an associate member of the European Defence Agency. EDF and PESCO projects, I mean, these are open to third parties, but we don't really take advantage of this. I believe I'm right in saying there's only one PESCO project that involves third parties and no EDF projects. And as we look forward, the European Defence Industrial Strategy is also going to be an important tool of integration. It already says a lot about Ukraine. I mean, that can be extended to other candidate countries. Beyond that, we have tools of intervention, which may be important. Training missions under CSDP, security-related funding under the European Peace Facility. The EU has made huge strides in this direction because of the war in Ukraine. And we should be able to build on that momentum to help other states too. Ultimately, if we as member states want to gain the security benefits of enlargement, then we need to be more ready to help those accession countries, those candidate countries, to build the security that's a precondition for that enlargement. But of course, the candidate countries themselves need to be willing and want to do this themselves.
And what about NATO and the, let's say, EU enlargement countries that for the moment remain outside of it? What can we do about them?
I mean, once again, we can enlarge. In many ways, it's a much easier process for NATO than it is for the EU. There aren't these chapters of the acquis to go through. The actual formal requirements for joining NATO are pretty thin, and even then are kind of advisory rather than kind of prerequisites. But where that's not possible, because it's a political decision above all, I mean, we should be able to build our partnerships to be stronger than they currently are. The NATO is at the moment kind of very focused on its Indo-Pacific partners. Well, of course that's important, but we could also be paying more attention to our partners on the peripheries of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Tony, for joining the Lighthouse podcast. It has been an extremely interesting discussion.